Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we are still in the month of Titan, and today is our 60th episode. Oh my god, that's insane. I didn't know I'd keep it up for 60 episodes, and I say that every 10 episodes, and I'm still surprising myself. But anyway, this time we're going to be talking about the Many, that's M-A-N-Y, mini games of Final Fantasy, M-I-N-I, games of Final Fantasy. Originally, the episode was just going to be about the card games, but I'm going to include some of the other mini games here as well, just for sake of time. So, mini games didn't really appear in full glory until Final Fantasy VII, pretty much, and there were a few in Final Fantasy VI, but you probably wouldn't even recognize them as mini games, and it would be a stretch to call them that. So, we're going to start off mostly with Final Fantasy VII. In Final Fantasy VII, there's a bunch of these mini games that show up. A lot of them you encounter throughout the game, and then later on they're kind of homogenized in this Disneyland kind of theme park, which is called the Golden Saucer in Final Fantasy VII, and it's actually brought back in Final Fantasy XIV as well, although completely changed. But after you complete them in the game, they'll show up there, and you get games like the snowboarding mini game, which was one of my personal favorites. You get the G-Bike game there as well, and both of these actually appeared later as mobile phone standalone games, which you cannot actually get sadly anymore. Alongside those, there's a submarine mini game, and there's several other little ones like a basketball game and a rail shooter and a few others, but one of the most impressive ones actually cannot be found in Golden Saucer. Most people call it the Fort Condor mini strategy game, and what you're doing here is kind of like a real-time strategy game. Maybe a tower defense game would be more applicable here, and it's actually pretty impressive for what it is. I mean, we're talking about full games in here that are inside this massive, just ridiculously long Final Fantasy VII game itself. And while most of them were pretty fun to participate in, there were a bunch that were not, like the stupid CPR game and the Shinra Parade. I can never ever get that right, and it's so frustrating. And there are just a massive amount of these types of games in Final Fantasy VII. The most prominent is probably the Chocobo Racing minigame, which actually have appeared many times throughout the series since then, and this particular minigame in Final Fantasy VII explicitly you use to get different colored chocobos, and those can go on different kind of terrain, and later on you can eventually get a gold chocobo, which you can get some really cool high-powered stuff. So just looking back on it, I don't remember Final Fantasy VII, being just jam-packed with minigames, but it really was. The next game in the series, the one that we're kind of devoting this month to, would be Final Fantasy VIII. And Final Fantasy VIII really scaled back how many minigames there were in lieu of a card game called Triple Triad, which a lot of people, including myself, loved. This game is almost universally praised and was one of the first games itself to properly start this card game within a game trend that you see a lot nowadays, like Gwent, for example, from The Witcher 3. The game had several different variant rules which would differ from region to region in the game, and if you played in those regions and went to another one, you could actually spread that rule around, which a lot of people didn't like, just because some of the rules were just insane, but it's a really interesting concept. And it yielded some pretty awesome rewards. But the best thing about Triple Triad was that it was easy to understand and hard to master, just like the hallmark of any good collectible card game. Final Fantasy IX doubled down on this game and introduced Tetramaster. Tetramaster has the kind of mechanics that Triple Triad had, but it basically turned everything up to 11. It's much more complicated, dealing with different kind of magical and physical stats and having different conditions and attack arrows and all kinds of other crazy stuff that, while on paper you'd be like, oh yeah, this is a much more complex game and it should be better, it doesn't really fold out in the way that you would want it to. So I guess Square really thought they had something here, and they put Tetramaster in the Play Online program that you use to get access Final Fantasy XI. While the game is much more technical than Triple Triad, it just seems like the vast majority of people prefer Triple Triad over Tetramaster, which is probably the reason why Triple Triad was incorporated into the latest and greatest Final Fantasy XIV rather than its Tetramaster counterpart. But that's not to say Tetramaster is bad or anything, it just has a really steep learning curve compared to Triple Triad. And actually both games have been ported to the PC by fans and have been created as standalone programs, which are just really awesome. I think it's great that the community comes together like this and creates something on their own because they just have such a passion for it. I obviously relate. So we can move on a little bit. We can talk about Final Fantasy X, and Final Fantasy X introduced a much beloved minigame known as Blitzball. It It was an incredibly in-depth kind of aquatic soccer or football, wherever you're from in the world, game. Personally, I'm not a sports guy, so I can't really speak much to this, but I know a ton of people who love blitzball, but I just could never get into it. I don't know. It just wasn't my thing, but I know a ton of people love it. There's a lot of other smaller mini games in Final Fantasy X as well. Not much worth here talking about. There's obviously the infuriatingly hard lightning dodge challenge, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. And just for completeness sake, Chocobo Racing makes a comeback here in this game, as well as some of the more recent games too. In the MMOs, Final Fantasy 11 and 14, there are fishing minigames and crafting. I don't really know if those would constitute as minigames, but they're there, so we should probably mention them. And in Final Fantasy 15, you also have a fishing kind of minigame with Noctis, because that's his skill. He really likes to fish. And in Final Fantasy 15, the only other minigame that's worth talking about is the pinball game, I guess, along with the Chocobo Racing I keep bringing up. So those are all the really big prominent minigames in the series, at least in the main series. Now there's some little hidden Easter egg games in Dawn of Souls and some other ones that honestly just aren't even worth talking about, but again, just for completeness, they do exist. So like I said, I hadn't really thought about it, but Final Fantasy VII just was completely jam-packed with all of this extra stuff. I guess they were just really, really excited and enthusiastic about getting to play with all these 3D engines, and they just wanted to see what they could do, and that's obviously shown in the Golden Saucer and all the little mini-games that you have. I mean, you go from Final Fantasy VI, which has basically nothing like that. I mean, there are a few event games, but those aren't really mini-games, to this just full-blown game. Honestly, that could have been sold by itself for, I don't know, maybe 20 bucks or something. And as far as my personal favorite of all of these things go, I'm a triple triad person. I love triple triad. I tried to get into Tetramaster, and as much as I wanted to, and as much as I knew how deep it was in the strategy and everything, I just couldn't do it. It was just too convoluted and frustrating for me. I know a lot of people like it. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't get into it. And that's pretty much all for today, guys. This is a pretty unique episode. I mean, you don't really hear about mini games in games, but I wanted to really give this its own spotlight because there are a lot of really good ones in here. And I'd like you to tell me what your favorite minigame is from the series. And of course, if you like this, please, share it around, help us grow if possible. And as always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.